Hi, I'm Lindsay Bugby from the Postman's Knock, and today we're going to talk about common pointed pen calligraphy beginner problems. So the very first problem that I notice when I'm teaching beginners is there's this definite tendency to wiggle the pen as you write, because when you're writing with a regular pen, which is, the writing instrument that you're used to, you've been writing with it all your life, you're using a lot of finger action, which makes the pen wiggle up and down and side to side. With calligraphy, it's a push and a pull motion. So as you're pushing, pulling, up, down, over, the pen always stays at roughly a 45-degree angle to the paper. So what does that look like? So if you're filling out a worksheet like this one, this is the Janet style worksheet set from the Postman's Knock, you will keep your pen at this consistent angle, go over, push up, pull down, and you notice the entire time I'm writing, the pen is not wiggling. It's staying in the same position as I push it up and pull it down. So in particular, you'll want to pay attention to your downstrokes. A lot of beginners have this instinct to do a downstroke like this. And what happens when you do that is the pen digs into the paper, and then the nibs, the tines of the nib have a tendency to splay open, which either dumps ink down onto the page or just makes the ink refuse to descend at all. So this is a big thing to work on, is the pushing and the pulling and not wiggling your pen around. If you're having trouble with this, and a lot of people do, what you'll want to do is just do a full page of drills where you don't pay any attention whatsoever to what you're writing. So the entire time you're writing, you'll just be watching your pen. And I want you to just write a series of S's and not pay any attention to what's on the paper. Instead, watch what your pen is doing. Is your pen levering up as you go down? Can you keep it at that consistent angle to the page where you're not wiggling it around? It's just staying at this nice angle, and what's doing the work are your fingers, your hand, your wrist, your forearm, and your elbow. Okay, so that is the first problem. The second problem that beginners tend to have is holding the pen too upright, because when we're writing with an everyday pen, so like a ballpoint pen, you're usually having it quite upright like this, so more of almost a 90-degree angle. No, with a calligraphy pen, and especially if you're a beginner, you want to try and maintain a 45-degree angle of the pen to the flat surface that you're writing on. So it's going to look like this, just like I just showed you, okay? You might notice on social media that there are calligraphers that maintain a very upright angle as they write. And really that's something that you'll want to experiment with as your skill level increases, because if you hold the pen at a higher angle, it's a really easy way to achieve nice razor thin upstrokes. But as a beginner, this angle will present you with a whole lot more problems than it will actually solve. So start with this 45-degree angle, and as your skill level grows, you can slowly lever up, especially for particular strokes like upstrokes or horizontal strokes. All right, the next problem. Not exerting balanced pressure on both tines of the nib. So whenever you are writing, like with a worksheet like this one, you'll want to make sure that your nib, the shank of your nib, so the blunt end, is like the sides of the blunt end, they're parallel to the slant lines. So the slant that you want to achieve, that is the parallel, that's the parallel lines that you want to reference. So basically, a lot of beginners like to come at calligraphy from the side, and let me show you what happens when you try to do that. So my nib is digging into the paper. The left tine is taking on a lot more of the force than my right tine. I'm trying to make a nice thick downstroke. I can't because one tine is doing the work. So there's my H that way. Now, if I exert balanced, even pressure on both tines of the nib, I can make a much more luscious H, which with much better contrast. Check out that downstroke. Do you see the difference? So this H is an H created exerting balanced pressure on both tines of my nib. Of course, a tine is those scissor-like things on the end of the nib here. And then this is coming at it from the side. So when you're writing, make sure that why am I having so much trouble explaining this? The side of the nib, the side of the shank, is parallel to the slant lines that you want to achieve. All right. So if you pull down, you would automatically make a parallel line. All right. So the next problem, not adjusting your ink consistency. I think when people start off learning calligraphy, there's this natural fear of messing with anything because you don't want to ruin it. And that's especially true of ink consistency. Well, what you'll want to do if you notice that your ink is acting up, so it's blobbing down on the downstrokes, the upstrokes are skipping, it refuses to descend from the nib, you probably need to play with the ink consistency, especially if it's an ink like Sumi or India ink. Because what happens is as you're writing, this ink is just sitting here and water is constantly but slowly evaporating out. And as water evaporates out, the ink gets thicker, it gets harder to work with. So you need to add water back in order to make the ink usable. How much water? That just depends on how much water has evaporated out. I just put in about 0.5 milliliters. And then you can stir the water in with a chopstick or the blunt end of your straight pen. And then it should write well again. So never be afraid to dilute. Do try to dilute with distilled water. I personally use tap, but it just depends on the water quality where you live. The problem with using tap water in some places is eventually your ink is going to mold because of contaminants in the water. So if you can get distilled, that's best. The other problem that people have using a paper towel to wipe water off the nib. So as you're writing, you'll be writing, and ink will be gunking up on the nib. So it's the same principle as water evaporating out of the ink in the jar. Water evaporates out of the ink on your nib, but at a much faster rate because there's so little of the ink on your nib. So as the water evaporates out, the ink starts to gunk up the nib, and you'll need to swish the nib off in water and then just very quickly get that water off and redip. So if you're using a paper towel for the step of wiping the nib off, what you'll find is paper towels are very fibrous and they have a tendency to get caught in the nooks and crannies of the nib. And you might not even see the fiber that's caught in there, but you realize it's in there because you'll be writing, and all of a sudden when you thought you were going to have one beautiful stroke, you have that one beautiful stroke plus another stroke because the fiber from the paper towel will actually pick up ink and put it down on the page too. So try to find a tight knit cotton cloth and use that to wipe off the nib, so that way there's no chance of fibers getting stuck in the nib, okay? Last problem, and it kind of relates to what we just talked to because it's about moisture, so swishing your pen off and also dipping your pen in ink. So many beginners don't realize that the pen is not to make any contact whatsoever with moisture. So ink, water, whatever. it does not get up in this pen. And it doesn't matter whether you're using a straight pen or an oblique pen with a flange, you've got to make sure nothing gets up in here, because if you get water up in here, then the universal insert inside, so this metal part, is going to rust, and that makes it incredibly difficult to get the nib in and out. If you get ink up in there, it's even worse because it's going to gunk up, and then again, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting the nib in and out. If you don't take the nib out after practicing and there's ink in there, it might act as a glue, and then you'll never be able to get the nib out. So when you go to dip your pen in ink, your nib in ink, make sure that no ink ever touches this part. So just try to dip up to the reservoir, really. And then when you are swishing off your nib in ink, that water never touches that pen. The water only interacts with the nib up to the point that the ink interacted with the nib. Okay, so I think that covers most of the beginner problems. I mean, there are always little things that you'll run into, but these are the biggies to keep in mind. Of course, if you have any questions about these problems or additional problems you're having, you can always comment. I'm happy to help. Hope you enjoyed the video.